Very interesting. I started by saying that climate change and pollution, although I didn't mention pollution, has economic costs, it has social costs, it has costs in terms of lives, but Susana has brought to the fore that it affects our health, it affects our fertility, it affects our IQ, so it's something that is becoming very important, but we'll have plenty of time to discuss all these things during the debate. And since the events come thick and fast, I'm going to now introduce Professor Teis Hansen, who is here next to me, he's a professor of innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Copenhagen and one of the leading experts on issues related to innovation and the green transition. And he's going to be talking about prioritizing research and innovation funds for the green transition. So Teis, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Andrés. Yeah. So thanks a lot for the invitation to come here and to talk about this topic, which is something that I am very interested in, and I think is important. Right? First, a very basic question here. Right? Why is there a need for innovation policy? It's a basic question. The answer to this question, or what we can call maybe the dominant answer to this question, has been changing over time. Right? So there's a very influential paper published some years ago that distinguishes 3 different generations of innovation policy. A first, more traditional one, seeing innovation as an engine of economic growth. Right? And innovation often understood as something that happens within the boundaries of, in particular, large firms. As we approached the 1980s, there was an increasing recognition that innovation is something that happens through collaborations. So if we are to understand how to actually promote innovation, then we also need to understand the whole system of actors that engage in innovation processes. Right? So innovation policy should also address these more systemic issues. For example, evident in interventions linked to developing cluster organizations and these kind of things, right? Forming collaborations between firms. But now, as we've talked about already this morning, right, we are in a very different situation here. Right? And we're in a situation now where innovation policy needs to do something else than create economic growth. Right? Innovation needs to facilitate transformative change. Right? So I'm going to skip a few slides because I saw there were too many last night when I traveled here, and go directly to this one here, the final of these generations. So this new link or new perspective on innovation and innovation policy is actually quite fundamentally different from what we had before. So innovation is now no longer seen as a means. Right? It's seen no longer seen as a goal. It's seen as a means to achieve other public policy priorities. Right? And these public policy priorities are often something to do with addressing grand societal challenges and promoting sustainability. There's also a change in the scale of innovation that's sought to be promoted by policy. Right? So we move away from focusing on developing new products and services or new processes, right, to talking about innovating entire systems. Right? So it's not so much about producing a new car or a new machine for producing cars. It is about innovating the entire mobility system. Yeah? And given that this becomes the emphasis on policy, there are also new challenges that policy needs to address. Right? So policy needs to take care of directionality, experimentation, demand articulation, and policy learning and coordination. And the first of these here is absolutely central, right? So directionality, what does that mean? What does that mean? It has been explained in this way. Directionality points to the necessity not just to generate innovations as effectively and efficiently as possible, but also to contribute to a particular direction of transformative change. Right? So this introduces a normative aspect to innovation. Right? Not all innovations are good. Right? So planned obsolescence, right? It's a business model innovation that was very good for profit lines in major electronics companies, very bad for the planet. Right? Should we keep on investing in becoming better at digging oil and gas out of the ground? Right? Arguably not. Right? And also in the financial space, right? We've seen financial innovations that had serious consequences for society in general, like collateralized debt obligations, right? That was an important reason for the financial crisis. So this means that, you know, we need to, in a way, distinguish between those types of innovations that we want policy to actually facilitate, support, right? And those that are unwanted. So how do we do that in practice? Right? The most sort of broadly used version of this new generation of innovation policy is the one named mission-oriented innovation policy, as popularized by Mariana Mazzucato, which has been extremely influential in policy cycles, right? To the extent that in the EU system, there's a whole part of the Horizon program that is now handing out research and innovation funds according to her idea about missions. Yeah? So what is the point here? Well, we have these grand challenges that are so broad that they are difficult to use as something to navigate against, right? So we need to make them more practical, more sort of concrete, right? And this is what missions are supposed to do. Right? So these missions should help address grand challenges, right? We formulate these missions, we make them measurable, we set a time frame for when they should be achieved, right? And then we use these as guiding post for actually handing out funds to research and innovation projects that are arguably helpful in addressing these missions. So just to give an example, right, one of the EU missions is called 100 carbon neutral cities in Europe by 2030. Right? So it's measurable, right, carbon neutrality, and there's a timeline for it, 2030. Right? And there are many different potential solutions that can help address this. And these solutions are then being supported through the Horizon program. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we have a lot of LSE people on the stage here today. I'm going to add one more, which is one of my personal academic heroes, Michael Storper, who is extremely good as always, like putting the finger where it really hurts. Right? So Michael, he wrote this book review a few years ago of Mazzucato's Mission Economy, yeah? Where he asks some very difficult questions. Yeah? And one of them, right, is really fundamental, right? And that is, how do we decide on which missions to prioritize? Right? So what he shows here is that in Mazzucato's work, there is not a convincing answer to the question of how do we choose which missions to prioritize. And that, of course, opens up for a danger that these processes can be captured by special interests. Right? And that is, of course, problematic. So, to the Danish context, right? So I'm from the University of Copenhagen. In Denmark, we've also adopted this mission approach to research and innovation policy. 2020, we got a new green research and innovation strategy, including missions. And you see the 4 missions here: CCUS, Power to X, climate and environmentally friendly agri-food, and recycling and reduction of plastics waste. So the good people in the ministry, they realized this, right? And this was part of the reason for why the Danish government decided to establish an expert group on the role of research in the green transition. Right? So we were 3 people in this expert group working a few years with 2 main tasks. One was, okay, we have this new generation of innovation policy. Policymakers don't really know how to actually do this, right? They haven't done it before. So can we increase the knowledge base about how to go about doing mission-oriented innovation policy? And then the second point, which was maybe the biggest one, right? So we were asked to develop an analytical framework to assess the effects of research and innovation initiatives on the development of solutions contributing to greenhouse gas reductions, right? Greenhouse gas reductions underlined here because, as Susana just told us, it's all about climate, right? And it's also what we were asked to do. Right? But of course, you should go broader than that, but I'll get back to it. Okay, first meeting we had in the ministry, right? Missions are everywhere. So the first thing that we asked, surely someone must have been thinking about this somewhere else, right? I mean, there's so much money today being handed out according to missions in the EU level, at national level, other places. Surely someone must have been thinking about, how to make assessments up front of which missions we would expect to sort of give the greatest benefits. Right? So there's supposed to be a tumbleweed going over here. Right? To sort of say, well, apparently not. Yeah. Apparently not. Yeah. So that was what we then set out to do. And the result is published in this somewhat lengthy report here called Tool for Ex-Ante Assessment of Green Research and Innovation Initiatives. Right? Essentially, what we propose here is a three-step model where there's some inputs, right, that we expect to come. Description of potential research and innovation initiatives, right? So suggestions for what could be future research and innovation initiatives, right? So think about it as, we have to select new missions. We get 10 missions in, and we want to benchmark these suggestions for missions. Right? So just as three sort of steps here. One, considering reduction potentials. Two, considering conditions for then successfully achieving these potentials, right? And the third one, important considerations, which doesn't say a lot, but which says basically what Susana said before, there is more in the world than just climate change mitigation, right? So maybe that should also be considered by policymakers. Okay, let me run relatively briefly through this, right? So if you are interested, there's a lot of details on data sources and operationalization, etc. in the report, which I'm happy to share if anybody wants to see. But I want to just briefly tell you a little bit about how we sort of think about the most important aspects within each of these three steps here. Right? So reduction potentials, right? So the starting point for all this is that Denmark has, as everybody else, right, climate targets. We need to live up to them, right? What is the role that research and innovation can play in this, right? So that also says something about territorial emissions being central, right? Yeah. So emissions coming from production activities in Denmark, right? This is what we were asked to look at. So we decided quite quickly that it doesn't make sense to try to, from the beginning, assess what will be the reduction impacts of a given research and innovation initiative, right? Why does that not make sense? Well, because research and innovation activities are by definition uncertain, right? So if you can actually assess the reductions that are very likely to happen, right? Then we are talking about solutions that are so mature that they actually do not qualify for research and innovation funding. Right? So instead, what we suggest is that, it makes sense to try to conceptualize, how big is the scope or the field of reductions or emissions in a given field that a mission is focusing on, right? So what really becomes core here is to match an initiative, right, with the potential for reductions that we see in a given field, right? So if we see here agriculture emissions in Denmark and how they have developed, right? So this gives us some kind of assessment of what is the whole scope for potential emissions if we are dealing with a broad agriculture emission. Right? Projections become important because we also want to make sure that we are not funding research and innovation activities where emission reductions are anyway going to happen, right? So it becomes important to look at so-called frozen policy scenarios, right? What's going to happen to emissions in a given field in 10 years or so, given the policies that are already decided. Right? So we know, for example, land-based transport will decrease significantly over the coming decade. So that is an argument against selecting a mission that's really focused on that. Right? Climate footprint, right? So consumption-based emissions are also very important. So we also include that. And then finally, global emissions are also key, right? So we were not asked to look at this. We were asked to strictly look at the national context, right? But if you think that a wealthy country like Denmark should also think beyond their own national emissions, right? Then it really becomes key to understand, which sectors are emissions actually coming from today, right? So personally, I think that the leverage for Denmark to actually do something in addressing the global climate crisis is not so much getting rid of our national emissions. We also have to do that, right? But it is to actually develop technologies that have global potential for emission reductions. Yeah? And then we consider for both territorial and global emissions, right? 1, what is the time frame for expected impact? Right? 2, are they considered easy or hard to abate? Right? It's much easier to decarbonize the electricity system than it is to decarbonize process industries with high temperature processes, to decarbonize deep sea shipping, etc. Right? And then thirdly, consider the risk of obsolescence. Right? So what are the risks that the solutions that are being developed will actually be overtaken by the time they become mature by other solutions that are already on the way. So this is our conceptualization of the sort of the reduction potential of a given research and innovation initiative. Right? What are then sort of important aspects to think about when you consider what are the conditions for then actually successfully doing this? Right? One is about investment and funding. Right? What would the price be of actually scaling up these technologies, right, once they become available? Right? And how does that match with the funding landscape that we see in Denmark? Right? That's important to consider. Then we have traditional sort of indicators of strength within research, innovation, and competitiveness, right? Like how brilliant our researchers are, how innovative are our companies. That's of course also important in order to make sure that the funds used for this are spent in a well way. Yeah? Capacity, right? Are there any obvious bottlenecks that should be taken into consideration as these solutions, they move forward, right? Human capital, right? Do we have the electricians to actually install all the solutions or all the different technologies that we develop, right? Infrastructure, and what we call here other input factors, right? Land, rare earth minerals, right? Very important input factors, right? And very often they are overlooked, right? So when we are at the research or the scientific stage of developing something, right, then you don't think so much about, well, in an upscaled scenario here, how much land will this actually require? And will that land be available, or will it be used for other things? And then finally, governance, assessment of governance conditions, which we sort of deal with in a quite simple way here. But it is important to understand, well, is the policy mix in place to actually support the upscaling of the solutions developed, right? Are the solutions considered legitimate, right? Is there support for it in a broader context between stakeholders, right? And would actors also actually, in the end of the day, be willing to change behavior, right? For example, when you you take decisions in the supermarket, or when firms have to make investment decisions. And finally, we have this important other considerations, right? Firstly, it's about political considerations, right? There are other things in life than climate, right? So what could be the potential influence of these research and innovation activities on other bottom lines? Biodiversity, pollution, distributional consequences, right? Important to have in mind also, right? And then we have this point called strategic consideration, which kind of introduces a portfolio thinking aspect, right? So it might be that a given mission is performing very, very well on all the different parameters, right? But there's already been a lot financed in this space by private sector actors, by other government agencies, etc., right? And then it might make sense to look elsewhere, right? To not skew the research and innovation landscape too much in one direction. So these are important considerations to have in mind. Okay, some reflections on this, right? So the idea here is not to sort of make an aggregated score and say, okay, this mission scores so well and this one less so, right? The idea here is to arrive at a point where decision makers, politicians, they take more informed decisions, right, than what they did before. And that's not very difficult to achieve because the decisions were not that informed before. Right? But hopefully this will help to actually make sure that we see better choices being made. Right? It's a big framework. Not all parts that I've gone through here will be relevant for all initiatives. So it's important for civil servants that use this framework to think carefully about it as they go through it. Right? And this also highlights another aspect here, which is that the idea here is also to develop something that is useful in the everyday context of a ministry with civil servants that have to deliver on quite short deadlines and do not have the time to invest in analysis that we often have in a university setting. Yeah? So there's a balance here between conceptualizing a very complex transition process, right? And then on the other hand, developing something that is useful for the people that actually have to use this. Right? This has been important. Less than perfect is better than nothing at all, right? Again, also because we didn't have that much before when we were taking these decisions. I think there's also a little bit of reflection here on the needed on behalf of our research community that are working with policy, innovation policy, and transition policy. Because when you have to actually make it into something that's very practically useful, right, it becomes clear that we haven't clearly operationalized all the key aspects of a green transition. We haven't made it easy for people working in practice, policy practice, to actually take up the knowledge that we produce in our research papers. Right? So there's a bit of homework for us to go about there, I think. And then a final slide, if I have time. Getting back to this point on who gets to decide on missions, right? That Storber mentioned. Right? So in the case of the Danish context, well, this is basically what this table shows here. It's very top-down, right? It's people in government, right, that so far have been taking decisions. Right? And what we've presented here in this report I talked to you about is a way of qualifying, improving this more top-down process of selecting missions. Right? There are other ways. Right? So in our neighbors in Sweden, they have a program called Impact Innovation, which is very similar. Right? But there it's much more bottom-up. Right? They don't take decisions on which missions. They leave it up to all the actors in the innovation system to come up, make consortia, propose missions, right? And then there's an evaluation process. Is that better? Not necessarily. I was part of evaluating that. And it's very clear to me that the programs that were selected in Sweden, right, were not addressing the most prominent challenges, in my opinion, right? But those that were selected were those that were good at writing an application and established a secretariat with people that were credibly able to lead this, etc., right? So there are different models, right? I'm not saying one is better than the other, but what we do need to do is to keep on qualifying the way that we actually select these missions, because there's so much money going into this. And so far, it's being done in a relatively suboptimal way. Yeah? Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Any last question before we... Yes, Pablo?
Thank you very much. The top-down and bottom-up system, the bias in terms of, from my point of view, just quick assessment is bottom-up. It will be more business-oriented in terms of the initiative, startups or people looking for, business, and the top-down, less business-oriented and more, let's say, policy or initiative, more government-oriented. No, is that correct? That reflection,
it's clear that it's business. It's also other actors, right, that have a bigger sort of say in what to fund, right? And the argument for that model is obviously, well, the people in government, right? How would they know what the right thing is? Yeah. So in a way, it's a question of how much agency you want to place in the hands of politicians and the bureaucrats, the civil servants in the ministries. Yeah. I guess that there's a move now towards putting more in the business side, right? So I mentioned this in Sweden, right? The same is the case in Finland, where we see that innovation policy becomes sort of more easy to formulate together with industry, right? Industry gets a bigger role. So I think that we are seeing a movement towards that, where perhaps the pendulum was swinging the other way for 10 years or so. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Teis.